right. Hello, everyone. I'm Lizstar,
I'm EnchantressOfNumbers.
and we are showing you about arcade speedrunning, the basics for your general idea of how to get into it. We're not going to be telling you, here's the split button. This is mostly just hardware. As you can see, it's very complex.
Yeah, so we figure at this point you're probably familiar enough with console speedrunning. The biggest hurdle to arcade speedrunning really is the equipment. So that's where we're gonna really focus on this. So let's go ahead and
jump right in.
Jump right in. Yeah, I guess for overview, what we're gonna talk about, the PCBs which we'll talk more about that. Talk about the Superguns, which there are a number of options for those. How to deal with some different video signals that maybe you're not used to running on standard consoles or PC. How to deal with interfacing your controls with the arcade game. And then a little bit specifically about the different standards of like JAMMA versus JVS for how you actually interface with the arcade game itself. So.
All right. So what is a PCB? A PCB is it's printed circuit board. So when you think of a video game, like let's say NES, it's equivalent to your actual cart. It's just completely out with no shell. So as such, it's pretty fragile. As you can see, mine broke and we have no idea why. So they're very fragile and you have to take good care of dealing with them. My way of dealing with it is, well, and yours, I
Yes.
got this from you, is we keep them in the same box that we got them in. Usually you order them online, and that's a good spot for them. It's basically perfectly fitting. Nothing can get into it.
Yeah, a USPS flat rate shipping box tends to be a really good size. Mm-hmm. Another thing some people do is they'll get some PCB feet and attach it to like a cheap cutting board from the dollar store.
It's your preference, whether you want something a little bit more fancy or something that looks like very bootleg.
Yeah, you could also like laser cut an enclosure and assemble it and do all that fancy work, but that's extra work, so.
Yeah, and special conditions, when you're looking into your PCB, of course, you're like, oh, I have a game in mind, I'll speedrun columns. Well, with columns specifically, it has an issue with many early Sega PCBs where it can overheat. So always be sure to research your PCB, because if you put it in like a really tight, cramped enclosure, it could overheat, could cause damage to the PCB and just stop working, and you're out of like $120.
Yeah, it's important to notice things like right here we have a really big heat sink there, so you know that that's an area that you want to be concerned about with heat. So. Mm-hmm. So then I guess the next thing is when you actually know the game you want to buy, where do you buy it? Because you can't just walk into Best Buy or Walmart and get an arcade board, right? So you can certainly find games on eBay or even Craigslist sometimes, and all of that is, buyer beware. You don't exactly know the conditions of it, but both of us have purchased boards off of eBay with great success, so just make sure you do your homework. If you're wanting to import a game from Japan, which is pretty common for games of this era, Yahoo Auctions Japan is another great site. And from there, there's a little bit of a hurdle because you typically will need to go through like a bidding proxy for it. And so I don't have any firsthand experience with that, but I do know a number of people who have gone that route to great success. So.
If you can't find it on eBay, your best bet is probably Yahoo Auctions Japan.
Yeah.
If it's a Japanese game, you're not going to find Sinistar on there.
Right, and there are some arcade parts resellers. A big one in Japan is Topps Games, which their like export division is called Sophia Corp. And I've bought a number of boards from them as well. And you can just find them online if you Google their name. Their customer service is great. I've never known anyone to have a problem with them. They might be a little bit more expensive than you might find somewhere else, but you're going to get a good quality product and everything there.
You're trading service and reliability for a little bit extra price.
Yeah, and then there's also the Coin Op Collector Forum, and that's another where you're trading basically with another enthusiast on the games, and they have sub-forums dedicated to buying and selling boards. So, but yeah, that's another place I don't have first-hand experience on. So,
Good luck.
yeah.
So now we move out of PCBs and we get to the Supergun. So if the PCB is your cart, the Supergun is your console, basically. It's what you plug into the PCB, and it translates all the video data to your TV. It translates all the input data and has the power supply, all that kind of stuff. So this is your console. It's simple as that. They come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. We'll be showing you them today, and they all have their pros and cons.
All right, so the first one, it's the one we're actually using today and we'll show off in a little bit, is the smallcab.net Supergun. So it is small and compact. It's kind of modular. As you can see, we've got an ATX power supply sitting up there right next to it. So that's how you power it. It doesn't have that built in. The inputs go over a DB15 standard, which is basically like VGA is also a 15-pin thing, but this is 2 rows instead of 3. So
we'll go more into that kind of input later.
And then for the pricing of it, so they're a French company, so the prices are all listed in euros. When I did the conversion when building the slides, it was for their light model, it was $43. For their deluxe model, it was $58.
You want the deluxe model.
Yeah, you probably want the deluxe model. It's got terminal blocks for if you want to wire stuff directly, like if you're using it to power a home-built cab, or if you, it also puts audio out over the SCART connector versus the light model does not. So, and then as the name suggests, you buy it from smallcab.net.
And then we have the Windy Gaming's ATP 300. That's what I use. So that's this big beast right here. Basically, whereas the small cab is a board in a small holding shell, they don't even all come in that small holding shell, do they?
No, yeah, the plexiglass enclosure is a separate thing.
Yeah. So usually you'd buy it and it would basically look like this kind of board. Not exactly like that. Whereas this is its own full, it's like buying a console. It has its own built-in power supply. It has its own built-in inputs and outputs. It's an all-in-one setup, so you can't mod it quite as easily. I assume you could. I have not looked into it because I don't need to. And the reason to get this over another one is if you are like me and you kind of shy away from the word SCART because it's scary and foreign,
Yes.
then this comes in composite and S-video and other such things. You can also have it come out in SCART for a little bit extra. So they usually range from like 300 and up, depending on what add-ons you get. So that might seem like a lot more than the $40 for the cab, but it's your preference.
Yeah. And then over there on the end, the big thing where you see 2 arcade sticks popping out of it, that's a Paint a Custom Supergun. And that's like a fancy Japanese thing. I had to import it from Japan. It's really expensive. I paid over $400 to get it to me. So, I mean, it's built like a tank, so shipping was not cheap. But some of the conveniences of it is that this is even more all-in-one than the Windy City or what? Yeah. Because it does include the controls. So for both 2 players, and then it will output in composite, S-video, or RGB. The RGB output is a little bit strange because it uses the same connector as Genesis, but the pinout is different. So if you do want to make use of that, you're probably going to have to like get a custom cable built for you. So,
Is it still in your tub?
the cable?
Yeah.
Yeah, the custom cable's still in my tub.
That's okay.
But it's just it's a SCART end with looks like a Genesis SCART cable basically. So one thing about these is they tend to have poorly shielded power supplies in them, so they often have some video interference when you're using them. So if you are a video quality enthusiast, then that's probably not the way you want to go. I would steer you towards the small cab because, the the video quality is just superb out of there. And yeah, like I said, if you're also scared of things like RGB modding and dealing with those different video signals that are not common in the United States at all, then I would steer you more towards the Windy City or the Paint a Custom.
And if you don't know anything about RGB, it might seem like this is $40 and you're like, oh, well, that's okay. If you use a $30 capture card you buy on Amazon like I do, that is not going to capture that. You'll need something really expensive. We're not going to go into that.
Yeah.
That's like on your own end if you're like, oh, well, what do I need to capture RGB? So don't just think, oh, well, that's way cheaper than a composite thing. Do a little bit more research if you're looking into it.
Yeah. It is also possible to DIY your own Supergun.
Yeah, so using like incredible magic and electronic know-how, you can hardwire your own Supergun. If you look at the quote down there, it's not a real Supergun unless it's held together by duct tape and dreams,
So
which is very true.
that's a quote from Kitaru, Tetris speedrunner, who famously has his own custom-built Supergun that he keeps in Tupperware called the Tupper Gun. So,
So, as we mentioned, PCBs can get a little expensive. They're rare. They're difficult to come by. So if you mess up your Supergun and have just a few things wrong, it could blow up your PCB. So you really want to be careful and make sure you know what you're doing. There are tutorials online. Neither of us know anything about this.
yeah, I was really wanting to build a Supergun before the event to show off here, but I just didn't have the time. So
It is tricky. Be very careful if you're going that route. But it is by far the cheapest.
yeah. The other thing is, like, a lot of people just want an arcade cabinet in their home, right?
It's fancy.
So it is totally possible to do that. They're just big and expensive and heavy and hard to move around. Also, in order, like, if you want to stream and capture from them, that is another additional hurdle because it's a lot. You don't have just a simple, like, cable that you can easily split to capture from. So a lot of times people will take, like, the this cable here connecting the PCB to the Supergun, they'll take one of those and then solder on wires leading to a VGA port so that they can capture from that. All kinds of interesting solutions there, but that's another, it gets a lot more complicated when you want to actually capture and stream that. And if you're looking for a cabinet, Craigslist might be your best bet. There's a lot of stuff you can find on eBay as well.
I found when I looked up, I found Pac-Man for like $300, and this costs $300. So that can be good, but then again, like eBay, buyer beware.
Yeah, and like eBay, most of the arcade stuff on there is going to be local pickup as opposed to like freight shipping and stuff like that. You wouldn't want to send that through the postal service, but there are some like dealers that you can track down, but they're a little bit harder to find. So
good luck. This is your slides.
Yes. So then, talking about the RGB signal, since the JAMMA edge on the PCB has pins specifically for red, green, blue, and composite sync, which is if you have a standard TV, then you're going to need to convert that somehow. If you have a PVM, then hey, you just need to get a BNC breakout cable to do it, and you're great. So there are a couple of different options for converting to component video if you have that available to you. There's the one on the middle there is a like $45 converter from Amazon that you can get. The problem with that is it doesn't have an audio output on it, so you'll need to either get a SCART cable with an audio breakout, or you'll need to find some other way to break out the audio from your PCB that way. There's a little bit more expensive version, which we're actually using here when we go to show, the Shiny Bow converter, and it does have audio output on it as well. So those are both good options for easily converting that SCART signal to component. You could also, if you don't have a CRT or the space for a CRT, you might want to play on a lagless LCD monitor. So you can upscale to HDMI, and the two main options for that are either the FrameMeister or the OSSC. And there's a couple things to be aware of. The FrameMeister works on a frame buffer, so it is going to introduce like a 1 to 2 frame lag on your game using that. It also doesn't handle video that deviates from the NTSC spec very well. So like Tetris the Grandmaster 2 has a bad crystal in the board and it runs at 61.68 FPS. That will not sync on a FrameMeister. But the OSSC works on scan lines, and that it duplicates scan lines basically. So the lag that it introduces is sub-frame. So if you have a low latency monitor, you can get down to like maybe a frame of lag playing on an LCD, which is pretty amazing. And last I checked, I believe the OSSC was cheaper than the FrameMeister, but basically you got to go online to buy those. There's a little bit of concern. The FrameMeister comes from Japan, where they use the same connector as the SCART connector, but it's wired differently to a JP21 standard is what they call it. And so you do have to be really careful about making sure that you're converting SCART to the JP21 that it expects. So that is a little extra headache there. So.
You know you're in a good hobby when everything is full capitals and like 3 letters.
Yeah, so then the next thing is if you want to, in order to capture it, you're going to have to split out the signal. So if you're using a PVM, you might have a pass-through that you can use, but otherwise you're going to want to use like either some kind of a matrix or a splitter to split that out. So you can get SCART splitters over there. We have, actually the SCART matrix I use in my own setup. So 6 inputs, 2 outputs. And that's a really easy way to split that out. But you can also, you can also get ones that split out the component signal if you're converting to that, or if you're upscaling to HDMI, you can get a really cheap and easy HDMI splitter as well. So, and then you can also use like a custom encoder, and this would be typically used more in the DIY Supergun category. But the JROC encoder is an outstanding encoder. It basically just takes those, ground plus red, green, blue, and sync into it, and then it'll encode it for composite video, S-video, and component video. And I know a number of people who use them and swear by them. So, but it does require a lot more electronics knowledge because you're gonna, probably you're gonna have a wiring harness that goes into the pins, and then you're gonna solder those to things with your JAMMA harness and stuff. So
when I first looked into it, I was going to get a cab and one of these, but my fear was that I would mess up and blow up everything and waste like $300. So I just bought this instead.
yeah.
So this is good if you are sure about what you're doing, and there's plenty of tutorials online if you've done soldering before. It's not so scary. It is for me.
Yeah, and the JROC encoder, I think you can usually get that for around like $45 or something like that. So, all right.
All right. So controls. So the main thing we've mentioned this entire time was DB15. Like every single one of these except for this use DB15. This is already like set up, so it doesn't need it. DB15 is, if you've ever heard of Neo Geo. If you've ever heard of Neo Geos, they use the DB15 standard. So a lot of Neo Geo controllers that you can buy, or like fight sticks, already come with it. If you are like me and you get this off of Amazon and it's $30, it has USB, which does not plug into DB15. So we use what's called the undammer. You can find this online. It's easy. It's like $20, and it just there. Now you can plug it into your console. Simple as that. Yeah. I'm pretty sure Windy City has, like, you can buy them pretty easily off of there, but you can find them very easily online just by Googling it.
Yeah, Paradise Arcade Shop is the biggest place I've seen them available. So.
Yeah, I think that's where I got mine. Go ahead.
Okay, so, like Liz said there, you can buy just an off-the-shelf fight stick like that. You could build your own fight stick. Also, if you don't want to deal with an undammed converter, or like when I bought mine, they were not readily available, you can also mod a fight stick for DB15, which is, so this one right here in front of Liz is my Mad Catz Fight Stick Pro, and I completely ripped out the internals and replaced it with one of these, which is basically just a breakout board that has the DB15 on there, and then you just use a DB15 cable you can buy on Amazon for like $10 or something to connect it up. And with the use of quick disconnect wires that plug easily onto the terminals of your buttons, they just snap right onto those ends there on the buttons. And then the screw terminals on the board, you don't even have to know how to solder to do that. So, I mean, you'll probably have to solder to remove the leads that were already in there, but yeah, it's actually not that difficult. The big thing is finding the pinout for the Neo Geo spec, and which we have that on there, but it came from the small cab site, so it's in French. All right.
You can go ahead.
Okay, so sorry,
You know this better than me.
yeah, since I've done a lot, like basically every fight stick that I've owned, I have modded in some way, so I'm relatively familiar with a lot of the different components. Like the Paint a Custom, I replaced all the buttons and joysticks. I replaced all the buttons and joysticks on my Fight Stick Pro. There's a few brands that you can choose from. I'm sure I didn't list all of them, but the two biggest ones that I'm most familiar with are Sanwa and Saimitsu, and those are two Japanese companies. Sanwa is like the gold standard for TGM. I'm pretty sure Saimitsu is big in the shmup community, so it's just really all of this comes down to personal preference. You could buy anything from any one of these companies, and it's going to be a quality product. So,
Sorry. Keep going.
okay. So just a little bit about some of the differences. I know the Sanwa has a longer throw, which I think is why the shmup community doesn't really like it. For TGM, we like it because it's got a square-shaped restrictor gate that easily rotates to a diamond orientation for four-way, so you can maneuver the stick very fluidly from the different directions.
It doesn't have diagonals.
Yeah. Whereas the Saimitsu, the restrictor plate for that is more of a clover shape, and so it's a lot more difficult to go from one direction to the other very fluidly. And then as far as like Hori and Hap, I don't know. I'm not familiar with what kind of restrictor gates they have, or if they even offer restrictor gates for those. But those are going to be bigger in like fighting game community and shmup type thing. I think Saimitsu is also big in fighting game community, bigger than Sanwa, I think.
We're both puzzle speedrunners.
Yeah, so I don't know a lot about all these the other like contingents of arcade world, but
ask your local community. They'll
yes.
know.
And then when it comes to your the joystick, you'll notice all of these have ball tops. If you go into, I think the arcade here has some bat tops, and really those just come down to personal preference, although it does tend to be that the Japanese style is ball top and American style is bat top. But really you can buy whatever top you're most comfortable with to fit whatever joystick you buy. So there are a couple of different sizes of buttons you can worry about. Most of the time the buttons you're going to be playing when you input are 30mm buttons, and that's what these are. The buttons that you would use for like credit or start tend to be 24mm, so that's just a thing to be aware when you're buying components, that you're buying the right size. And then the other big thing is concave versus convex buttons, and that's another like regional difference, that the concave buttons tend to be much more of an American thing, convex much more Japanese. I'm a little biased. I like the concave or convex buttons. They're a lot easier to mash on, so if you're playing a game that you need to mash, you probably don't want concave buttons.
All right. So getting past all the modding and getting back to the idea of console cart. So we're getting into JAMMA. JAMMA stands for Japan Amusement Machine and Marketing Association. and they're a group over there who are basically in control of all the standards for arcade equipment. And during '85 and up through the '90s, they enforced what was called the JAMMA standard, which is this. This big old hunk of cables is the JAMMA standard.
You can think of it like the 72-pin connector in your NES.
Yeah, it's as simple as that. It enforces plug and play, which is pretty. I find really nice because that means you only need one thing like this, and you can just plug it straight into your PCB. It's as simple as that. It's like any other console. It uses 56 pins. Trust me, there are 56 in there. And some require extra pins. So mine, for example, comes with those. And that's for certain games like Street Fighter II, World Warrior, X-Men. Again, it's as simple as looking up what game you want to speedrun and looking into extra hardware. That sounds kind of scary, but it usually isn't that right. Scary to get the extra pins.
And the extra pins are usually just used for additional inputs, whether you're going to have 4-player support instead of just 2-player support, or 6-button support instead of just 3 buttons. So,
yeah, and so a lot of the time it's not even that necessary. But if you want the full arcade experience, then look into that. And the extender, this is an extender. If you have a setup like this, the extender is good because then you can't really plug the PCB right into the Super Cab. These are like $6.
Yeah,
they're really cheap.
You could, in theory, plug them directly into each other and it would work just fine, but it allows for more versatility in how your space is set up. So,
all right.
Okay. So the other one, this kind of superseded the JAMMA standard, is JVS, which is used in like the Taito Type X line of arcade solutions, or like the Sega Naomi. And basically, in order to interface your controller with it, you're going to need some kind of an I/O board, which is what that thing is.
That's the okay.
Yeah, so this is the I/O board. Basically, it takes the USB from the JVS computer, basically. The Type X is modified Windows XP, and the game is stored on a hard drive rather than a printed circuit board. So advancements in technology, but then you still need to break out the input from that USB to the individual micro switches on your controls, and that's turns out it's really easy to just convert that to JAMMA to deal with it that way. But there are other I/O solutions that you can use as well. And then the other cool thing about it is that it allows for a high-resolution video. So off the JAMMA standard, it only outputs 15 kilohertz video, which is 320 by 240 resolution. Basically what you would have off of an NES or SNES. But with JVS, you're running a computer, and so you can put a computer graphics card in there, and you can output whatever you want. For example, the Type X can do 31 kilohertz video, which would be like 640 by 480 resolution, or what they called at the time high resolution. So I think
you can go a little bit more in depth. We're pretty far ahead.
Oh, we are?
Yeah,
well,
if you wanted to go.
We haven't actually shown off the game running yet.
Okay.
Do we want to do that now, or?
Let's do. We only have like one more slide.
Okay.
Might as well get that over and then.
Yeah, that's fair. So, but yeah, basically, so the way the newer standards with the Type X and stuff, that has the game resides on a hard drive, and so you buy the Type X box, and then you'd buy hard drives that come with security dongles, and that allows it to decrypt the hard drive when it boots up and launch the game and let you play it. So, and then I'm beyond like that. I don't know a lot of the other options for newer arcade games, but I think a lot of the speedrunning community that I'm involved with tends to be more into the retro stuff, and so
all the 90s mostly.
Yeah, all the 90s, late 80s, 90s stuff, and so that's gonna put you square in the middle of JAMMA territory. So,
and then we have pre-JAMMA. This is the Dark Ages. So this is your Pac-Man. This is your Sinistar. This is your
Donkey Kong.
All all of the early arcade games didn't really have a standard, so they just did their own thing. They had multiple custom parts that had to all be there to work and all in their own kind of funky way. It's really obnoxious to get the entirety of all the PCBs. Like, if you look at my... So this is columns. It's one board. That there, I think, is Pac-Man, and that's like 7 or 6. So you only have to take care of one thing, whereas for that you have to take care of like 6. There are ways to circumvent some of it. I have that on the left. That's a Sinistar JAMMA add-on. So you can mod it to actually output to JAMMA. But again, you have to know a little bit of know-how. You have to know how it works. Tutorials are online.
Right. And those kinds of converters to convert to JAMMA are game-specific. So if you're trying to play a very obscure game, one of those may not even exist. But if you're playing something like 1988 Sega Tetris, for example, I know you can get a converter for that. So it just really depends on what kind of thing you're looking into. So
I found a lot of them on arcadeshop.com, which is a really it's a really generic website. But I found a lot of good stuff on there. So if you're like me and you're like, oh, I want to play or speedrun Sinistar at some point, that would probably be your best bet instead of getting all the bunches of stuff. Unless you really want something authentic in your room that is like a big old cabinet, that's probably your best bet. If you also want to go into Superguns and stuff.
yeah. So I guess we want to switch over to the... Yeah, okay. All right, so you saw we had all this stuff already hooked up here, so we figured we'd just show off that, hey, this actually does work and everything, so... and this way I get to make Liz play Tetris, so...
I was going to make her play columns, and then it didn't work. I'm really upset.
Yeah, we're going to look into that after this, but...
Okay, you can talk about whatever you want to talk about.
Yeah, so, I don't know, just basically it's working, we're playing on using upscaling with an OSSC to get into the capture card and the monitor that we're looking at, the projector as well. So all of this works. There's not really a ton to show off at this point, just that, hey, this does in fact work. This big rat's nest of everything that we've got up here, you can connect it in a way that makes sense and does work. So our last slide was just one for questions, so while Liz is playing, if anyone has any questions, we would be happy to field those, so yeah. Yeah, of course. So the question was about modifying your stick to replace the buttons or the joystick, going into a little bit about what's involved in that. So it really depends on what you're dealing with. So sometimes they're soldered on, and so you have to desolder the wires to be able to do it. Sometimes if you're lucky, they're just going to use quick disconnect wires that you can pull off, and I'm sorry I don't have an example of what those look like to show you, but then, so there are actually two different kinds of buttons. There are ones that snap in, and then there's ones that have basically like a little collar that screws onto them. Either one, they work just fine, but the ones that snap in, you just, once you remove the wires, you can pop the button out, and then you just snap the new one in place. And if you're using the quick disconnect wires, you just punch them back in. You put one to ground, one to the input. It doesn't matter which one. And that's all you really need to do at that point. And so it's good, especially one thing I didn't mention about buttons was with the Sanwa versus Saimitsu, is Sanwa buttons are really like on a hair trigger. And so if you like to rest your fingers on the buttons, or if your hands shake a little bit, you're likely to get accidental button presses. And so, but Saimitsu buttons require a little bit more force to actuate. And so if you do like to rest your hands on the buttons, or if you do shake a little bit, then those are often preferential for people. It's just really, personal preference at that point. When it comes to the joysticks, there's a little bit more going on there because, so like this one has individual terminals on each of the micro switches, and so that's like these you're gonna have to solder wires onto, so that's a little bit more complicated. But like, and this is a Sanwa, or no, sorry, a Saimitsu, I'm not sure what model. But if you get a, like a Sanwa JLF, like that has a wiring harness on there, and so then you can just plug a harness right into the 5 pins on it, and then you may have to solder those wires onto the other ends of the solder, or of the wires of the harness, so that those inputs go where they're supposed to go. So there is, I would say, like, basic soldering skills are probably necessary, but depending on your setup, even those may not be necessary. If you already have quick disconnect wires and you already have a joystick with a wiring harness and you're replacing with one that's got the same pin out, it's really just unplug, remove some screws, put the new thing in, and then plug back in. So basically, yeah, it would vary from no soldering to light soldering. So, yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Okay.
So the question, was, is in the general arcade community, is it acceptable to only use original hardware, or are emulators also acceptable?
Yeah, and I guess I would answer that by saying it kind of depends on, much like in console speedrunning, you know, each game community defines their own rules, and it's much that way in for arcade as well. So like, if you want to get on like the Arika's leaderboard that they have for TGM, they won't accept your time if you're using an emulator. But if you're on, you know, speedrun.com, a lot of those ones do allow emulator. So it's really just a case-by-case thing. Being a hardware enthusiast, I like to try to get the purest form of experience that I can. So that's why I like collecting all these things. So,
for example, I basically invented the columns community on speedrun.com, and I allow emulator. So it is just a preference. I found no problems with emulator looking into it. I just prefer original hardware. Because kind of once you go original hardware, you don't go back.
right.
But I absolutely understand emulator. This stuff is expensive.
Right.
So in the future, if you want to get into it, that's cool. But if you're like, well, right now I don't have literally $500 to spend. The only reason I got this is because I got a tax break. To be perfectly honest with you, I was like, oh boy, $900 from taxes. Let's go buy a bunch of arcade equipment.
Yeah, and I mean, you also do run into some situations where a game may not be emulated very well, and so like that may be the reason why they don't allow emulator runs in a community. Not that it's anything against emulators, just that the emulation for that particular game is not where it needs to be for accuracy purposes. So, yeah. Yeah, so the question was basically someone starting from scratch, ballpark estimate on how much it would cost to get up and running with, for example, a TGM1 setup. So that's a good question, and so if we do the small cab route, that's like, I don't know, what was it, like $50 for the small cab?
It was like 43.
43, okay, so we'll round to $50, make the numbers easy. Your power supply, you can probably get that for what, like $30? I don't know, it's
Probably.
just an ATX power supply. You want at least 350 watts, so, but you can get those pretty cheap there. The board itself, you're probably looking to spend between $200 and $300 on a TGM1 board. You can find much cheaper boards out there.
My columns board was about $98.
Yeah.
My
so
Columns 2 board is like $80.
Right.
So.
And then you can also look at something like TGM2, for example, and that board, if you can find it for under $1,000, you're looking pretty good. So there's a great disparity in price based on what game you're looking for there. So when it comes to dealing with the video signal, I'm going to quote, because if you're starting from scratch, you maybe don't have a PVM, you don't have the space for a PVM, you don't want it. That's a huge expense that you could probably get around with an OSSC and like a good LCD monitor. You can get the OSSC for like $200, I think, and you can get the monitor for about the same, probably, maybe even a little bit less, a low latency monitor. Then you're gonna need a fight stick. You can get actually a pretty decent, like the Kanba Carbon is a pretty decent introductory fight stick for like $60. And then the undammed converter for that would be another 20. So then you'd need a SCART cable. You can get that for like $10. I haven't been keeping track of all the numbers.
So about $280 for the stick and the board, and then the Supergun, all that was about $440.
Yeah.
Whereas if you go my route and you say have a GV USB 2 that you bought on Amazon for $30, so that's $30. Then this was about $300, so $330. Then the board, which mine was like $100, but let's say TGM, because TGM will work, so that's another $200, so that's $530, and then this, so that's about $600. So
Yeah.
they're relatively even.
Yeah, and then like with the Paint a Custom, that was expensive. That was like $400 plus $200 for the board. But then I just used a regular TV that I had, so that was came out to about $600.
Yeah.
So
it depends. A lot of it would be looking into where you plan to go in the future. If you want to go more than just, hey, this is a hobby, I'm going to like just get into it right now. If you want to go the crazy route and have all RGB, and you're like, okay, well, I'm also going to mod my NES into RGB because I'm a mad person.
that's me. I feel really called out right now.
Then that's a good option. Where if you're just like me and you're like, well, I just want to stream it, I just want to show it off, I want to bring it to places and be like, hey, let me show you my Columns board and try and get you to play Columns. Have you heard the good word of Columns lately?
I have not. I'm actually a little scared.
Play Columns. So yeah, it just depends on where you want to go. I would say my setup is a little bit less expensive. But
Yeah.
not by a whole lot.
Yeah, and I would say my setup is overly complex because I've got like RGB everything running into a PVM, upscaling for capture. I've got both a SCART matrix and an HDMI matrix in my setup. It's a little ridiculous. So it is easy to dump lots and lots of money into this stuff.
Yeah, it is very easy. But yeah, good question. Any others?
Yeah.
You mentioned that with an OSSC, how does that
Right.
how does that compare to
Yeah, emulation will introduce lag into your setup, and that's a thing that's on a game-by-game basis as to which one has how much lag there is. Some games may be more well optimized than others, but you're still probably going to be at, like the best I've heard of has been at like in the 2 to 3 frames of lag window. So you're going to be, and they can be even worse than that too. So your best bet is really going to be, if that's what, for speedrunning, we don't like the lag, we don't like dealing with that, which is why so many speedrunners insist on running on actual hardware. So doing it with the OSSC and a lagless display is going to be, you're going to get a better, more responsive experience than playing on an emulator that way.
But even with just the like hardware and a slightly laggy display, I'd say it would be even better than emulator, but probably not that noticeable.
Yeah.
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 is it also still possible to get competitive with the lag? Like, is that
Yeah.
They asked if it's possible to get competitive times with a slightly laggier display.
Yeah, and I can say that that it is definitely possible to put up really good times on emulator for. I know TGM is a game where we're doing like frame perfect synchronized rotations. We're doing all kinds of ridiculous things where you have, like if you're playing, what is it in? Actually, a good example is in TGM3 on actual hardware. You've got about 4 frames of lag, I think. So it's hardly the best experience just on the natural thing, just because it feels a lot laggier than like TGM2 is just a crisp, super smooth experience. But even on that, you can, like there are people, you can do things like Shirase 1200 mode where you've got like 8 frames of lock delay with those 4 frames of lag. Like that's a thing you can learn to adjust and compensate for and put up really competitive times. So yeah, I would definitely say especially if you're not sure about the investment or you're not, you just don't want to pay that money, which is totally understandable. With emulator stuff, you could definitely still put up competitive times.
And as a note, in columns 2, world record in 2 of the categories is an emulator. So, any emulator could possibly, it's skill as well, but you would be probably better at it with a little bit less lag.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
With the JVS board,
Yes.
were any older games converted, or are older games available for JVS, like Street Fighter?
Right. Yeah, so the question is, with the JVS standard, are older games converted or made available to use the JVS standard? And as far as I know, the answer there is no. They've, because the JAMMA, basically if you're, so in an arcade where you have your cabinets set up, like the cabinet will either be wired for JAMMA or wired for JVS, and then they just swap the boards out that way. If you only have one cab and you've got a JVS game and a JAMMA game, then I know some people will wire player 1 for JVS and player 2 for JAMMA, something like that. Or otherwise, it is a bit of an endeavor to rewire your cab for that. So that is that's one nice thing about the Supergun, is that it's really easy to just use a Capcom I/O board like this to basically you just this requires the Supergun like the Taito Type X itself doesn't require a Supergun. But if you want to use this for inputs, you need the Supergun to power the I/O board, basically. So, and yeah, you just plug in the USB there, and then you do that. It can actually take a 15 kilohertz VGA signal and output it over JAMMA if you wanted to. But if you have the capability of using the 31 kilohertz, why wouldn't you do that? So, but yeah, good question.
Any others? All right.
All right. Well, I guess that probably concludes our panel. So thank you all for watching, coming out and joining us and asking questions. I hope it was informative and that you enjoyed yourselves.
Yeah, I hope you get into arcade speedrunning and just hobbying in general, because it is really fun. It's kind of scary, but once you get into it, it's pretty simple and fun.
Yeah, and I will say, like, just reaching out to other arcade enthusiasts, like, we're super happy to share our hobby with people, so don't be afraid to ask questions if they come up later. So,
if you have any questions, you can reach EnchantressOfNumbers and me on Twitter, on Twitch, wherever.
Yeah, and we'll probably both be in the practice room later with our respective arcade setups. So,
Yeah.
if you want to try anything out.
Literally immediately after this.
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you all.
Thanks.